The chart in my hands belonged to Marcus Chen, and the name hit me like a collision I'd been waiting for without knowing it. I'd been the chief of occupational medicine at Riverside Medical Center for 8 years now, a position I'd built brick by brick in absolute silence, and suddenly my past was walking through the clinic door in street clothes and a grimace. My assistant had flagged his intake form with a note. Acute hand injury, repeat patient, check old records. I pulled them up. The dates went back 23 years. I recognized the handwriting on some of the older forms before I recognized anything else. My mother's signature, authorizing treatment for my younger brother when I was 24, and she was still convinced I would never be anything worth listening to. I sat in my office for 2 minutes with both charts open on my desk. The room was exactly as quiet as it needed to be. Then I called him in. Marcus walked in favoring his left side, and he didn't register me at first. When he did, it was just the standard patient-to-doctor recognition, the kind that happens 1,000 times a day in medicine. No collision yet. He didn't know who I was underneath the white coat and the nameplate that read Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, MD, Chief of Department. He had no reason to. But I knew. I'd always known exactly who he was. Before I examine him, I want to say something directly to you. If there's someone in your life who looked you in the eye and told you that you'd never be smart enough, that you didn't have the discipline, that your ambition was a waste of everyone's time, especially if that person was supposed to protect you, comment below. I need to know you're out there. I need to know I'm not the only one who had to prove it in silence. But to understand why that moment with Marcus mattered, I have to take you back. 19 years back, to the summer I turned 24 and my family's contempt finally crystallized into a single, unforgettable act. My father had died when I was 3. I don't have real memories of him, just the shape of an absence and my mother's bitterness about it, which she distributed evenly among everyone within reach. My mother was a nursing assistant, a genuinely skilled one, by all accounts, but she had never pursued formal education beyond her certification. She'd made peace with that limitation long ago. Or she said she had. What she actually did was watch my older brother David sail into a business degree and a job at a finance firm, and then she watched me, 2 years younger, talk about medical school as though it was a reasonable ambition for someone from our neighborhood. The words started early. You think you're smarter than everyone. You think you're going to be special. People like us don't get those kinds of chances, and you're going to learn that the hard way. My mother had a gift for the kind of cruelty that sounds like care. She wasn't wrong that our family had no medical professionals. What she meant was that I shouldn't even try. My undergraduate years were hostile. I worked full-time at a hospital, entry-level positions, patient transport, unit assistant work, while carrying a course load that nearly broke me. I was studying biochemistry and physiology in classes taught by professors who assumed I was there as some kind of affirmative action placeholder. I wasn't there because my mother believed in me. I was there because I couldn't afford to fail, and somehow that's a better motivator than love ever is. Medical school acceptance came in March of my senior year. Johns Hopkins, I called my mother from the hospital parking lot where I worked. I was standing next to a service entrance and I remember the exact texture of the concrete wall behind me. That's nice, she said. Do you have money for it? The financial aid package was substantial, 90% covered. I had applied for loans, federal support, private scholarships. The remaining 8%, roughly $23,000, was a gap I was confident I could close. I'd been closing gaps my whole life. I'll figure it out, I said. You won't, my mother said. And when you don't, I don't want to hear about it. The conversation ended there. She didn't say congratulations. She didn't ask about the program. She had already decided I would fail, and in her mind, that decision had already happened. What I didn't know until August, 2 weeks before I was supposed to move to Baltimore, was that my maternal grandmother had left something behind when she died 3 years earlier. It wasn't much. $40,000 divided equally among her 3 adult children. My mother's share. The will had language about education, about opportunity, about breaking cycles. My grandmother had written it specifically because she understood what my mother had chosen to deny. My mother kept the money. She told me about it when I asked, point blank, if she would help. We were in the kitchen of her apartment. My older brother David was there. He knew already. That money is for my retirement, my mother said. I'm not throwing 40 years of work away because you want to play doctor. It's supposed to support education, I said. The will language was clear. I'd had a lawyer, a friend's father, pro bono, look at it. Your grandmother should have been clearer about what she meant, my mother said. Besides, you're not her child, you're mine, and I'm telling you that money is not yours. David had looked at his shoes. He'd been to 4 colleges and switched his major twice, all paid for by our mother without argument or question. I left her apartment and drove to a coffee shop and sat in a booth with the Johns Hopkins acceptance letter in my bag. The financial aid office had said they could wait until August 15th for a final decision. It was August 8th. I had 7 days. I didn't tell anyone what I was about to do. I didn't call my brother or my mother back. I didn't email my undergraduate advisor. I wrote down the name of the Johns Hopkins Occupational Medicine program on a piece of paper, not because I'd been accepted to it, I hadn't applied yet, but because I knew, somewhere deep in my nervous system, that if I was going to do this, I was going to do it alone, and I folded that paper and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. The first year without my mother's help was the kind of difficult that doesn't make a good motivational poster. I worked 60-hour weeks at the hospital while taking classes that met at night. I borrowed money from the credit card David had gotten me, not help from him. He was indifferent to my situation, but access to his credit history. I got a studio apartment the size of a large closet. I ate the same 3 meals for months. The Johns Hopkins Financial Aid Office, to their credit, worked with me. They found additional funding. I took out more loans. By the end of the second semester, I had cobbled together a way forward. But there was a near collapse in the middle of that first year. My microbiology exam came back as a failing grade, not a low pass. Genuine failure. The professor was Dr. Richard Hoffman, and he taught like he was personally offended by anyone who didn't already know everything. I was working a double shift the day before the exam. I slept for 3 hours. The exam was cumulative and comprehensive, and there was no curve. When I got the grade back, the number seemed impossible. I remember standing in the hallway outside his office and making a decision not to cry, not as a gesture of strength, but as a practical choice. Crying would have been wasting time I didn't have. Dr. Hoffman called me to his office the following week. I was certain he was going to tell me I didn't belong in medicine. Every part of my upbringing had prepared me for exactly that conversation. What he actually said was, "I know who you are. I see your hospital records in your application file. You're working 60-hour weeks. That's not an excuse for the exam score, and you know it. But I also know that score doesn't measure what you're actually capable of." He wrote the date of the retake on a sticky note. "Study for 2 weeks. Come back. If you don't understand something, my office hours are Tuesday and Thursday at 3 o'clock. I retook the exam. I went to his office hours twice. I scored a 92. Dr. Hoffman wrote a recommendation letter for medical school that took up an entire page and a half. He never mentioned the original failure. He wrote about what he'd seen in me, the kind of commitment that doesn't announce itself loudly, the kind that just shows up and does the work. Medical school was different in almost every way from what I expected. It was hard, but it was rigorous in a way that my mother's dismissal had never been. People challenged my knowledge, not my worth. By the end of the first year, I'd stopped waiting for someone to discover that I didn't belong there. I belonged. I knew what I was learning. I could read a histology slide and understand pathophysiology, and reason through a diagnostic problem. I was good at it. And I still didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell her I'd been accepted. I didn't invite her to my white coat ceremony. I didn't tell her about my board scores or my clinical rotations or the morning I realized that the work actually healed something in me that her voice had broken. There was one moment during my 3rd year of medical school when I almost told her. I was doing a rotation in emergency medicine at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and I was presenting a case, a complex trauma admission, to the attending physician. I was correct in every particular. The attending sent me a look across the conference table that said, "I see you. This is real." And I thought about calling my mother, about making her listen to the story of what I could do now. I didn't. I went back to my apartment and I wrote it down in a journal instead, word for word, and I locked it away. I had come too far to give her any power over this narrative. After medical school, I did a residency in occupational and environmental medicine at a hospital in Philadelphia. I was one of 8 residents that year. The program director was Dr. Emilia Rodriguez, who ran her department like it was a ship, and she was a captain who actually cared about everyone aboard. After I finished my clinical rotations, she called me into her office. "I'm bringing you on as an attending here," she said. "It wasn't a question. 3-year contract with a focus on occupational injury prevention, you're ready." I was 29 years old. I had student loan debt that stretched into six figures. I had no house, no savings, no safety net. I had a salary that meant I could finally begin to breathe. Dr. Rodriguez knew most of my story, the financial strain, the isolation, the fact that I had no family support in any real sense. What she didn't know was that I'd already built a secondary strategy, a plan within a plan. I'd been reviewing the occupational medicine literature, the regulatory frameworks, the gaps in how workplace injuries were being documented and analyzed. I'd been thinking about what it meant to actually see people in their work contexts, to understand the system failures that harmed them, not just the individual pathology. My first 3 years at Riverside Medical Center were spent building a specialty clinic focused on workplace injury prevention and occupational health screening. I wrote protocols. I trained staff. I documented outcomes. I published 3 papers in occupational medicine journals, each one advancing an idea I'd been developing since my mother had told me I wouldn't amount to anything. And my family had no idea. My mother called me once a year on my birthday. The calls lasted about 8 minutes. She'd ask what I was doing for work, I'd give a vague answer about working at a clinic, and she'd say something about hoping I wasn't wasting my time. My brother David didn't call at all. My younger brother Marcus, the one who would eventually walk into my office as a patient, had followed David into business and maintained the family's general indifference to my existence. I was the person who'd left. I was the person who'd wanted something they couldn't understand or approve of, and so I'd become the person they didn't ask about. When I turned 35, I was promoted to Director of Occupational Medicine at Riverside Medical Center. 2 years later, I was named Chief. I had a team of 8 physicians and 12 support staff. I was presenting at national conferences. I was consulting on cases that involved significant settlements and insurance determinations. I had access to health insurance coverage databases, medical records from complex cases, workplace injury documentation that very few people outside of occupational medicine actually understand. And I still had that piece of paper in my wallet, the one I'd written, Johns Hopkins Occupational Medicine Program, on all those years ago. I never filled it out as an application. I didn't need to. I was building exactly what I'd written down that summer when my mother had told me I would fail. The closer I got to 40, the more I understood what I'd actually been doing all those years. I hadn't just been building a career. I was building a position from which the truth would be unmistakable. I was becoming an expert in the exact domain my family had convinced me to doubt. Every paper I published, every case I resolved, every insurance policy I navigated, it was all part of a structure I was building alone, so thoroughly and so carefully that no one could ever deny it again. My trusted confidant was my colleague Dr. James Ockhaffer, an orthopedic surgeon who consulted with me on complex workplace injury cases. We'd worked together for 12 years by that point. He was the only person in my professional world who knew about my family's dismissal, about the $23,000 gap my mother had chosen to let me face alone. When I was promoted to chief, he was the one I told first. He'd known for years that I was carrying something, a particular kind of stillness in how I worked, a precision that felt like it was built on something deeper than just technical skill. "Your family still doesn't know?" he asked. "No," I said, "and they're not going to know until it matters." What I meant by that, I couldn't have said at that moment, but something in my body recognized a threshold approaching. I was in my early 40s now. I had a corner office and a decision-making role in complex medical cases. I was a specialist with authority. I was secure. And then, in November of a Thursday evening, my younger brother Marcus called me for the first time in 4 years. His voice was different than I remembered, tighter, uncertain. "It's the hand," he said. "I injured it at work. The company's workers' compensation is being difficult. I think there might be something wrong with how they documented the injury." I don't know who else to ask. The words took a moment to arrive at their meaning. He was calling me for medical expertise. He didn't know he was doing it, but he was asking me to be exactly what my mother had told me I could never be. "Where did you get hurt?" I asked. "At the manufacturing plant. Hartwell Industries, out past the city limits. It was 6 weeks ago. I don't know, they're saying the injury report shows something different than what happened." I'm confused about what my coverage actually includes. I felt something shift in the architecture of the story I'd been building for 20 years. The ground beneath it was moving. "Bring the documentation," I said. All of it, the incident report from the company, your medical records, the workers' compensation claim denial if there is one, bring everything. Really? He sounded shocked that I could help. You can actually do that? Yes, I said. I can actually do that. We scheduled him for the following Wednesday. I hung up and I sat in my office for what felt like a very long time. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, to the entire structure of who I had become demanding to be seen. But it wasn't time yet. The real collision, the one that would prove everything, hadn't arrived. It was coming, though. I could feel it in the same way I'd felt every other threshold in my life, with absolute clarity and without any certainty at all. Marcus arrived at my clinic on a Wednesday morning carrying a manila folder that looked like it had been through a disaster. Inside were the documents from Hartwell Industries, the initial incident report, his medical records from their occupational health clinic, the workers' compensation claim, and a denial letter from the insurance company dated 3 weeks after his injury. The denial was brief and absolute. Claim denied based on discrepancies between employee account and company documentation. See attached incident report. I laid everything out on my desk and read through it carefully while Marcus sat across from me. The incident report was dated the day after his injury. It was signed by Richard Voss, the plant manager at Hartwell. The report said Marcus had failed to follow safety protocol and that the injury mechanism was inconsistent with the workplace setup. The language was clinical, but the conclusion was clear. His own negligence had caused the injury, and therefore the company bore no responsibility. The problem was that it didn't match what Marcus told me had happened. He described a machinery malfunction, a hydraulic arm on an assembly station that had activated unexpectedly. He'd been standing in the normal operating position. The equipment had failed, not him. The company told me I was doing something wrong, Marcus said. They said if I'd been following protocol, it wouldn't have happened. But I was doing exactly what I was trained to do. The machine just went. I asked him to describe the machinery, the exact position he was in, the angle of the injury. He did. Every detail was internally consistent. The injury pattern, a crush injury to the metacarpal region, was consistent with what he was describing. The timeline was consistent. His account was credible. But Richard Voss had written something different into the official record. Let me do some research, I told Marcus. I want to look at the safety standards for that equipment, the maintenance records for that specific machine, and the OSHA documentation for Hartwell's facility. Give me a week. After Marcus left, I called Dr. James Acaffer and asked him to meet me for lunch. We went to a restaurant 2 blocks from the hospital, a place where we'd had dozens of conversations over the years, most of them about cases, a few of them about life. I need an attorney, I said. Someone who handles occupational injury disputes and workers' compensation appeals. Someone who won't be intimidated by a company like Hartwell Industries. James knew immediately what I wasn't saying out loud. This is about your brother. It's about a workplace injury that was documented false, I said, and it's about my family having no idea what I've actually become. James pulled out his phone. He called a woman named Patricia Wu, a partner at Brennan & Associates, a firm that specialized in occupational injury litigation. He told her I would be calling that afternoon. He told her to take the case seriously. That evening, I had the first consultation with Patricia Wu. She was sharp and direct, the kind of attorney who asks the right questions in the right sequence and doesn't waste time on pleasantries. I gave her the incident report, the medical records, the insurance denial. I told her what Marcus had told me about the machinery. The real question, Patricia said, is whether there's documentation from Hartwell that contradicts what the plant manager wrote. Equipment maintenance logs, prior incident reports, safety inspection records, anything that establishes the machine was already malfunctioning or had a history of unexpected activation. I know where to find that, I said, or I know how to get access to it. What I meant was that through my occupational medicine network, through professional colleagues who consulted on workplace safety, through the medical records systems that interface with workers' compensation insurance, I could request the documentation that Hartwell was legally required to maintain. It would take time, but it was within my professional purview to ask for it. Patricia drew up the language for the appeal. Within 3 days, I had submitted a formal request for Hartwell's equipment maintenance records, their OSHA documentation, and their prior incident reports. The request came from me, on Riverside Medical Center letterhead, citing my role as Chief of Occupational Medicine and my involvement in the case. It was entirely routine. It was also a signal. Someone with institutional authority was now paying attention. I didn't tell my family any of this. 2 weeks later, I got a call from my mother. It was not her birthday call time. The tone of her voice was different, tighter, more urgent. I heard Marcus had some trouble at work, she said. Something with an injury. Yes, I said. He's being treated for a hand injury. The workers' compensation claim was denied, but that's being appealed. By who? She asked. By his medical team, I said. The answer was technically accurate. I was his medical team now. Well, I hope he's not making a big deal out of nothing, my mother said. Companies don't deny claims without reason. If the insurance said no, there's probably a good reason. I kept my hands flat on the table. I looked at the window of my office, then back at the phone in my hand, and said nothing for 3 seconds. The medical evidence will speak for itself, I said finally. Don't make him get mixed up with lawyers, my mother said. That's how people lose money. Tell him to accept it and move on. I'll give him the information, I said. After I hung up, I sat in my office and understood exactly what I was about to do. My mother thought she could still direct the narrative. She thought the institutional decision had already been made, and that Marcus was foolish to challenge it. She thought I was still the person she'd dismissed 20 years ago, someone without authority, without standing, without the ability to change how the system worked. She had 2 more weeks. The OSHA records came back first. Hartwell Industries had received 3 citations in the past 5 years for equipment maintenance violations. 2 of them were for the exact assembly line where Marcus was injured. One citation, dated 8 months before Marcus's injury, specifically flagged inadequate preventive maintenance protocols on hydraulic systems. The company had been warned. They had documented knowledge that the equipment was at risk. Then the maintenance logs arrived. There was a pattern in them that made everything clear. The hydraulic system on the specific machine Marcus had been using was scheduled for replacement 6 months before his injury. The replacement had been flagged as urgent. It had been postponed twice. By the time Marcus was injured, the system was running 14 months beyond its recommended service interval. Patricia Wu called me as soon as she reviewed the documentation. This is a defense-killing document set, she said. The company knew the equipment was at risk. They documented it. They didn't fix it. They injured your brother. Then they lied about the cause in the incident report to avoid liability. How much? I asked. Depends on the medical prognosis and the extent of his disability, Patricia said. But with this documentation, we're talking settlement territory. Significant settlement territory. I'd estimate a minimum of $180,000, potentially up to $400,000, depending on what the medical records show about long-term functional impact. I had Marcus come back to my clinic. I did a comprehensive occupational medicine evaluation, looking specifically at his functional capacity, his pain levels, his ability to return to his previous work, the likelihood of chronic disability. The injury was real and it was permanent. His dominant hand had lost significant grip strength. His fine motor control was compromised. He would never work the assembly line again. He would never do the kind of manual labor that had been his career. I documented all of it. I wrote a detailed report that established the causal relationship between the machinery failure and his injury and the permanent functional consequences. I signed it as the chief of occupational medicine at Riverside Medical Center. The report was unambiguous. This is going to change things, Marcus said when I showed him the documentation. Yes, I said, it is. Patricia filed the appeal on March 15th. The documentation was devastating. Hartwell's insurance company requested a settlement conference within a week. They wanted this resolved before the case went to hearing, before the maintenance logs and the OSHA violations became public record, before a judge could award punitive damages in addition to compensatory ones. The settlement conference was scheduled for April 3rd. It was in Patricia's office, with a mediator present, and representatives from Hartwell's insurance company. Marcus was there. Patricia was there. I was not there, but my documentation was there. My report was there. My authority as chief of occupational medicine was there. The insurance company offered $220,000. Patricia countered with $350,000. The insurance company came back with $290,000. They settled at $320,000, with an agreement that Hartwell would also fund a workplace safety audit of their equipment and update their maintenance protocols. Marcus called me afterward. He was crying. I don't know what you did, he said. I don't know how you got all this information, but you saved me. I did my job, I said. I documented what happened. The truth did the rest. What I didn't tell him was that my job was to be exactly where I needed to be at exactly the moment my family needed me to be there, that I had built my entire career in preparation for this invisible intersection. That every paper I'd published, every case I'd resolved, every hour I'd spent understanding occupational medicine at the level of institutional and regulatory authority, all of it had been leading to this moment when I could change what was real and what was recorded simply because I held the authority to make it so. My mother called me 3 days after the settlement was finalized. This time there was confusion in her voice, and underneath it, something else. Something that sounded like the beginning of understanding. "Marcus said you helped him with his case," she said. "He said you're the one who figured out the company was lying." "I reviewed the occupational health documentation," I said, "as part of my role at Riverside Medical Center." "What role?" my mother asked. "What exactly is your title?" I could have answered that question 5 years ago. I could have answered it 10 years ago. The fact that she was only asking now, that she was only curious now that it had become relevant to her survival, was its own kind of answer. "Chief of Occupational Medicine," I said. "I oversee the occupational health program at one of the largest medical systems in the state. I consult on cases involving workplace safety violations, equipment failure, and workers' compensation disputes. I publish research. I present at national conferences. I train other physicians in how to recognize occupational injury patterns. I have a team of 8 physicians and 12 support staff. I have the authority to document medical findings that affect insurance coverage decisions and legal settlements." The silence on the other end of the line was very long. "I didn't know," my mother said finally. "I know," I said. "That was intentional." 2 weeks later, my mother called again. This time she asked to see me. She asked if we could meet somewhere. She sounded different, smaller, uncertain. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near my office. She looked older than I remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing her clearly for the first time in decades, without the filter of needing something from her or hoping she would approve of who I was becoming. She ordered coffee and we sat at a table by the window. "I owe you an apology," she said. "More than one. I owe you an apology for what I did with your grandmother's money. I owe you an apology for telling you that you wouldn't amount to anything. I owe you an apology for not believing in you, for not supporting you, for making your life harder than it needed to be." I looked at her hands on the coffee cup. They were shaking slightly. "Yes," I said, "you do." "I was afraid," she said. "I thought if you failed, it would mean that no one from our family was supposed to reach for anything bigger. I thought if you didn't make it, it would prove something about us, about people like us. I thought I was protecting myself by not letting you try." "That's not my job to fix," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to, I'm just telling you why." We sat with that for a while. I didn't forgive her. Forgiveness wasn't what the moment called for. What it called for was honesty, and I had finally given her that. I had shown her who I actually was underneath the silence she had enforced. I had documented the proof. I had made it undeniable. And I was still here, still myself, still whole, still moving forward. My mother finished her coffee. We made plans to have dinner the following week. It was tentative, fragile, nothing like a real relationship yet. But it was something. It was the beginning of her understanding that I was not the person she had tried to make me into, and that I had never needed her permission to become who I was supposed to be. I didn't tell anyone at Riverside Medical Center about the settlement. I didn't mention it to Dr. Rodriguez, who had hired me all those years ago. I didn't tell my colleagues. The case was closed. My role in it was professional and documented. What happened in that room was between me and the documentation and the insurance company and the mediator. What I did tell James was the outcome. We met for lunch again, at the same restaurant, and I laid out the timeline and the documentation and the settlement figure. $320,000, he said. "That's a significant recovery for a first appeal." "It was a significant case," I said. "The company knew the equipment was dangerous. They chose not to fix it. They chose to lie about the cause, and then they chose to assume that no one with authority would care enough to look. They underestimated you," James said. "Everyone did," I said. "That was their mistake." That conversation was 2 years ago. Marcus is doing better now. He retrained as a quality assurance specialist at a different company, one with better safety protocols. His hand will never be what it was, but he's built a life that doesn't require him to sacrifice his body. My mother and I have a real relationship now, something that started with apology and grew into something more honest and more grounded. We don't pretend the past didn't happen. We just move forward from the knowledge of what it was. My role at Riverside Medical Center has evolved. I was promoted to medical director 2 years ago. I oversee not just occupational medicine, but workplace injury prevention and institutional safety protocols across the entire hospital system. I chair the Safety Review Board. I consult on cases that go to settlement. I teach the next generation of occupational medicine physicians how to see what matters in a medical chart, how to recognize when the institution itself might be lying, how to document evidence that changes outcomes. And I still have that piece of paper in my wallet. The one where I wrote Johns Hopkins occupational medicine program all those years ago. I don't need it anymore. I've become everything it promised. But I keep it anyway, as a reminder of who I was when I still had to believe in myself alone. If you've ever been told you would never become anything by someone who should have protected you, you're not alone. You're not foolish for dreaming. You're not arrogant for wanting more. You're just building what they couldn't see. And one day, they'll have to look at what you've made, and they'll finally understand. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. The most powerful thing you can do is build in silence, away from the people who tried to convince you it was impossible. Let them be shocked. Let them be confused by your competence. That confusion is the sound of their assumptions breaking. 2. Documentation is evidence, and evidence is power. Every single thing you accomplish, every paper you publish, every certification you earn, every case you resolve, write it down. Create the record. Make it official. Make it institutional. Because one day, someone will need proof of who you actually are, and institutions only recognize what they can see in writing. 3. You are not defined by your family's belief in you, and you were never meant to be. You are defined by what you choose to build when no one is watching. You are defined by the work you do in silence. You are defined by the person you become when you finally stand in your own authority. Was I wrong to stay silent for 20 years instead of fighting with my family to make them understand? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.